This is The Persuasion Game, the Forge's podcast all about the art of persuasion. Each episode, we connect with marketers, business leaders and beyond to learn how they use persuasion to influence their customers, convince their stakeholders and drive their businesses forward. Hello, Laura.
Hi, Adam. How are you?
I'm really well, thank you. Yeah, having a good week. How is life for you today?
Very excellent. Well, today we are going to be talking about some iconic brands that have really been with us all our lives and they're still very relevant today. So I suppose the question is, when I ask you about iconic brands, what's coming to mind for you?
So it's going to make me tear up talking about this one, but I love that John Lewis advert, Always a Woman, where it shows that woman growing up from being a girl into a kind of teenager, young woman, and then she gets older, and her house changes through the years, and it's incredibly moving. And I think it's one of those ones that often comes up in kind of case studies. You see them around in marketing case studies from time to time, and every time it does, you find yourself in a sort of slightly different life stage, slightly older when you see it, and a different bit of that advert will connect with you in a slightly different way. So the idea that now I've got children of my own, I kind of see children run around in the house, it's really quite moving. How about you? Any iconic advertising from nostalgic brands that you can bring up?
I mean, I seem to remember watching a lot of telly when I was younger, and one of the ads that I always remembered was the VW advert with Paula Hamilton, which dates me a lot.
Oh, yeah.
But she's like leaving a house and she's obviously had a big fight with someone. She takes her ring off, throws it in the gutter. She takes her big old 80s earrings off. And then she gets in her VW and she's like, at least I can rely on something. And I really loved that. And then years later, they did another one, which was about VWs not needing to be refilled so much. And it was all about how people had seen a mysterious car traveling through the middle of nowhere and it never stopped. So it must be an alien car. And they were going, it was like a VW. I don't know if you remember it.
I don't. I'll have to look it up.
And me and my mum and my sister used to walk around just going like a VW, like practicing if we had actually got the accent right, which just goes to show advertising was a lot more pervasive and, people were watching the same channels and the same mediums a lot more.
You could really kind of capture a cultural moment with an advert, couldn't you?
That's right. Yeah. Whereas what we're seeing today is a lot more, multi-channel and a lot more fragmentation. So the interesting thing we'll talk about with Nick, our guest, is really how to understand how do we take those iconic brands and translate them for modern audiences and modern channels.
And one thing to add is a new thing that we're going to be doing on this podcast is when we refer to adverts that we think have been great, that we've seen when we were younger, we're actually going to start popping the links to those in the show notes so that you guys can watch them along too.
So you can rate my accent.
You can rate the accent, yeah. Please write in and rate Laura's accent.
Please don't. Thank you.
On this episode, we're thrilled to welcome Nick Graham, an experienced leader who has held senior roles at PepsiCo Beverages North America, and more recently as Global Head of Insight and Analytics at Mondelēz. Nick is known for his ability to drive lasting change within global organizations, particularly in the realms of brand strategy and consumer insights.
Nick is also a thought leader on organizational change and persuasion, guiding teams through challenging transitions with a focus on storytelling and vision casting. He now works as a freelance consultant, helping companies navigate the future of consumer insights, particularly as AI begins to reshape the landscape. Welcome, Nick.
Hi, great to see you both.
Yeah, absolutely. Nick, thrilled to have you with us today. Could you share a little bit about these two roles, Mondelēz and Pepsi, and sort of top line your involvement there?
Sure, absolutely. Well, so just starting at the very beginning, well, it's always a good place to start, right, in a story. I started my career in advertising, then in brand innovation consulting, and indeed worked with a lot of folks from The Forge in my early career, which is fantastic that our paths cross again. And then I spent the last 10, 15 years of my career to date in corporate roles. So, as you said, I led insights and analytics for PepsiCo's global beverages team. Then I led the US insights team after that. And then most recently, as you said, I led the global insights and analytics function for Mondelēz. When I first got the offer of the job, I told my husband, I literally just told him who it was working for. And he said, yes, you need to take this job. I said, you don't even know what the job is. He said, I don't care if you're going to be making chocolate and biscuits. It's a pretty good job to have. It's such an amazing role. Having made the decision for us to move back to Europe earlier this year, I'm now back consulting, as you said, very kindly describing what I'm up to. And really, it's so timely that we should have this conversation about persuasion, because really what has fascinated me throughout my career, but I think particularly the last 2 or 3 roles that I've done, is really helping organizations like Mondelēz, like Pepsi, work out how to drive change, both in the organization and in the marketplace. Because we talk a lot about change, we talk a lot about the impact of change, but it's one of those things that everyone talks about, but most people don't spend a lot of time actually thinking about how to achieve and the complexity of achieving it and what it's going to take for that to be successful.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nick. Could you share a bit more about your role at Pepsi?
It's interesting just to think about the types of change persuasion jobs to be done in big organizations. I mean, to be honest, this is true of any organization. I'm sure it's true of an agency. It's true of a big corporate. Part of my job in both Pepsi and Mondelēz is persuading my own team to do things differently, right? To embrace change. And we'll talk a little bit about that, I guess, as we think about things like AI and digitization, which is obviously transforming the way that insights functions work. So part of it is about changing your own team and yourself, of course. The second part is about persuading your leadership team, your peers, your senior leaders in the organization to act on the insights and the learnings that your team is coming up with. Particularly challenging when that challenges their strongly held beliefs. And then fundamentally, all of that is very good, but ultimately you then need to be able to persuade retailers, customers, clients, shoppers, consumers, the end person, whoever that is, to obviously act differently and to buy your brand and your product. I think a lot of the time in organizations, people think about pieces of that, but actually all 3 need to really work together, because usually there's always some end consumer or end client, and those other pieces sometimes get forgotten often. And as I thought back about my stories of change, yes, there's often a change in the end consumer, but often it comes from a change in the context, a change in the decision-making behavior, change in the way that the team operates, which then unlocks the change in the external environment as well. So very much thinking about how those two sides of change, I guess, come together.
I think there was perhaps, if I cast back into the mists of time when I started 20 years ago, a kind of idea that insights was the voice of the consumer and that marketing was the voice of the brand. And I think what you're reflecting on is this idea of actually everyone is thinking commercially, everyone should be thinking about the consumer, and how do you kind of use that to create a much more holistic sort of workflow and a way that's keeping consumer insights there, but also linking it to some commercial realities, right?
Totally. And I think one of the biggest change vectors, I think, for insights and analytics as a function is recognizing that their role in the organization is changing, right? I actually hate when people talk about insights as the voice of the consumer, because it feels like you're disconnected from the business, right? All your job is to do is to bring some really interesting data, bring some insights about the consumer, and your job stops there. But in fact, to me, when insights is at its most powerful in an organization, as you say, it's an insightfully minded commercial function. And ultimately what it cares about is driving the commercial success of the organization. It's just doing it from a slightly different lens. It's doing it from a lens of how to motivate consumers and shoppers in the right way. As you say, I think that's a big mental shift for my old teams, but also for our peer functions as well, because it changes the way that insights and analytics shows up in the organization and changes the way that they behave. And I think particularly in Mondelēz, one of my biggest jobs to be done was to help inspire and empower the team, the insights and analytics team, to feel like don't just wait for the famous seat at the table, right, to be delivered to you. Grab hold of that seat. And we used to talk about this in one of our team meetings, is don't wait for a seat to be given, take a freaking seat to the meeting, and there is your seat at the table. Own the seat at the table. The world has changed dramatically for insights and marketing, and will continue to do so for the next generation as well. So I think that recalibration of what insights needs to do in the organization, that's one of the big ways of change, vectors of change that insights needs to think about.
I guess it's a mirror of how people are relating to brands as well. When we grew up, advertising was, very top down. I'm going to dictate the conversation, single channels, sort of dominating conversation, and that's how it kind of got stuck in your mind. And now it's very much consumer-led, isn't it? Whether that's them creating content or, hyper-targeting of consumers, and also just the abundance of information that you can get about consumers. It's much more fluid.
It's much more fluid, and just the sheer proliferation of content and ways of connecting with brands, connecting with consumers means that the power dynamic, as you sort of implying, has shifted, right? Because fundamentally, those are, as we said, those are the end people that we need to influence in order to be able to drive the change for the organisation.
At the same time, marketers are being given more and more on their plates. There's much more DIY approach. There's much more accountability across a huge range of functions. So how did you go about getting people close to consumers? How did you actually get that cut through with the audiences you needed to?
When I worked on Pepsi, when I first moved to the US beverages team to lead the insights function, one of the biggest challenges, it was literally just after the Kendall Jenner ad dropped. So as you can imagine, it was the team was reeling from the after effects of that advert. And I think one of the things that strikes me as I think back about sort of moments of change in my career that I've seen, that I've been part of, I think there's usually some sort of catalyzing change of context that happens. Sometimes it's a crisis like that, right? Sometimes it's a positive change, but sometimes it is that sort of crisis moment that galvanizes people and makes them open to change in the first place. So when I joined the Pepsi team, and I think there was generally a feeling that the brand had lost its way, right? It was struggling from a sales perspective. The team had really focused for a long time on building sort of more kind of cultural capital, building sort of their cool factor, obviously partnering with a lot of the latest artists and musicians and everything. But it wasn't really working, and I think it wasn't really working from a business perspective. And I think we in the insights team as well felt that the brand had lost its way. It becomes so focused on the timeliness, like being cool, being the latest, having the latest cultural connectivity, that it really lost sight of why it existed. It's sort of timeless why. Why did it exist in the first place? But I think for a long time, we've been trying to push this message through data, right? So showing that our advertising wasn't performing as effectively as it had used to, showing the data, which actually, the marketing team originally sort of felt that where our problem to solve was with the younger generations, right? This sort of obsession that we have to be able to recruit the next generation. Although I think the insights team for a long time have been pushing this message through data, the data alone, and this is a lesson for all of us, right? The data alone wasn't enough to convince people to change track. So I think two things happened. One is you had the kind of change of context. So the Kendall Jenner ad created this window, this moment when people were suddenly like, I think something is wrong. I think something needs to change. So there was like an open-mindedness to change. And what we did very quickly is we said, well, let's actually use this moment to go and talk to the people who buy our brand. Just go and talk to our core consumers. Let's hear from them. Let's actually go and hear the stories that people have to say. Let's not worry about the data. We have the data. Let's go and hear and have consumers tell their story. And what became quickly obvious was our core consumers who were middle America, middle-aged, grown up with the brand for 30, 40 years, they had a very emotional reaction to the brand. Like when you talked about the brand, their faces lit up, right? There were lots of positive emotions deep there, which again, it's very difficult to express with a data set, right? You have to be there and experience it. So we took our senior leadership team to middle America, to the Midwest, to our heartland, to meet with our core consumer, to do one-on-ones, and just being able to see that reaction. But what became very obvious was that they felt disconnected from the brand over the last 30 or 40 years. So when you ask them for any examples, their stories of when they enjoyed drinking the brand, their stories of what they remembered from advertising, they were all from the 80s and the 90s, right? Which in some respects is great because that's a formative period for many of them. So they remembered Michael Jackson, they remembered Britney. I mean, a lot of people remembered advertising, which actually was before they were born. So there was this sort of like cultural memory of some of this advertising. But they really didn't remember a lot in the last 20 years. And actually, when you talk to them and you showed them stuff, you could see that it just didn't feel like it was talking to them anymore. Again, no amount of data could replace those one-on-one immersions with consumers, to just better understand the people we were really trying to connect to, but to hear it from them and to sort of see their reactions of just realizing that there was this cultural disconnect that we'd unintentionally created with our core consumer, I think created this catalyst for us to go back and say, yes, the brand wants to be cool and it wants to be timely and, wants to be, up to date and all those things. But how do we do it in a way that actually speaks to the core values of the brand and actually celebrates the heritage of the brand? But it was the combination of the sort of storytelling and that catalyst of that context change moment, that was the big opportunity. So then we could talk about the data. Then we could show some of the ideas and the inspiration that the team had been coming up with, some examples of how brands were doing that. But you needed that, it goes back to the simplicity of the behavior change wheel. To make it understood, you need to have the right context for that to be heard and understood in the first place. And so we were lucky in one respect. There's always an element of luck or bad luck in this case, bad luck. And then there's an element of jumping into that and using human storytelling and empathy as the sort of vehicle to actually communicate that message and connect with the team.
I think that's fascinating. And I suppose the challenge that I could see with making people understand a bit of that tension that, maybe we're leveraging the wrong values is what I always associated Pepsi with is the voice of a new generation. And I suppose what you could argue is that there was a perception of, well, that's what we're leaning into. Like, where's the new generation? Whereas actually what you were saying was the context has changed. There are still values we can tap into, but they're not the strap line. They're not the thing that was like most obvious to people. It needs to be something a bit more subtle than that. And let's uncover what's actually meaningful to consumers.
Exactly, right. And so, as you say, I think the challenge that the brand had is because through the 80s and the 90s, it had sort of used that comparison with Coke as the example, right? So and the strap line became the brand for a lot of people. And yet, there is something that's very true about it. Like, it is a brand that's always been disruptive and challenged the status quo a little bit. However, I think the brand has sort of lost sight of the core purpose of the brand, and was just very much focusing on being associated with the latest cool things, because that would be the vehicle to being sort of culturally relevant, as opposed to saying, at the heart of this is a brand that is about just sort of youthful disruption, youthful exuberance, a little bit about challenge. But how do you maintain that to make that relevant for someone who's now 40, 50, 60, who actually really remembers very positively that feeling and that sense from the 80s or the 90s, but also linking it back to sort of a more intrinsic feeling that people of any age could connect to. And I think then, where we pivoted to in 2018, it was the 120th or 125th anniversary of the brand. For the Super Bowl ad that year, we intentionally used a lot of our nostalgic references from the past, but each expression, we also used a modern expression as well, right? So we had a NASCAR driver, and we had the bit from Back to the Future, right, where he's got his Pepsi Perfect. So we used a combination of historical, God, it feels old to say that, but like 1980s, 1990s references that everybody would get. And then we use sort of modern expressions, but through it all, we tried to show that there was a sort of a fun, disruptive, challenging heart at the heart of Pepsi that you could engage at any sort of age range, right? At any
it's like
at
a
any
timeless
stage
spirit
of life and any generation. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's it. And so trying to find a way to communicate that timeless spirit through a combination of older, more nostalgic references and more modern references. But I think where the brand had been before is it had lost sight of what that timeless spirit was, and it just thought it was about the timely expression of cool things. And if you lose that connection, that to me was where we just lost a lot of our core consumers.
That's a really revealing, insightful take on a lot of the stuff that we saw happen with Pepsi post that advert. Are you able to share some of the other changes to the kind of logo and the pack and what that created in terms of the strategy of Pepsi that we see today?
Yeah, so I think the other thing that we sort of run away from is just celebrating the flavor. I think almost we embarrassed by the fact that it was a soda, embarrassed by the fact of the sort of nostalgia that we had. And I think 2017, 2018, we just leaned back into that and said, well, no, you should never be embarrassed about those things. Those are some of the things that make the brand good. And I mean, it's polarizing. Some people love it, some people not, but you've got to lean into the heart of what the brand is all about. So we went fundamentally back to celebrating that sort of timeless spirit of the brand and the product itself. And you really then saw that first off in communication, right, so in above the line communication, but then even in things like our restaurant ads and food service ads, we sort of just leaned back into the fact that fundamentally this is a really great tasting, slightly sweeter product than Coke, and sort of leaned back into the flavor profile of the product and just sort of unashamedly did that. I think finding ways to get that balance right between being true to yourself as a brand and true to your spirit, but finding new ways to express it. And then the logo to me was a great example. I mean, it launched after I'd left, but we worked on it extensively while I was still in the team. And I think it really came from this recognition. The logo, which I think was from the early 2000s or the late 90s, almost had become a bit apologetic, right? And it lost some of this connectivity. So we had consumers just draw Pepsi logo. It's the classic thing. You've seen Heinz do it, right? You've seen lots of people do it. But what was powerful is they all drew the sort of 1970s, 1980s logo. Almost nobody drew the new logo. It was 20 years old, I guess, by that point. Both people who'd been with the brand 40, 50, 60 years, and people, Gen Zers, who'd probably never seen it, or certainly never seen it in store. And so what there's a recognition is that sort of simple red, white, and blue, we needed to go back to the heart of that, because there was something, I remember when with one of our senior leaders, sitting in a focus group, watching some of our core consumers, and we were just testing out some different directions of packaging, and we had this logo design that was very similar, certainly reminiscent of the old logo. And you just saw people go, oh my God, this is like the old logo. And you could see the energy in the room. You know, when you can feel in a piece of qualitative research, you can feel the energy go up.
I felt the same when I saw it. When I saw the rebrand, I felt exactly the same. I was like, oh wow, the old one's back.
What I thought was nice about the way that they did it is they sort of borrowed, obviously, very heavily on those old design cues. And again, sort of very consciously trying to connect back and reconnect with our core consumer. But they decided to do the word mark in a much more sort of bold way. They even, the way that they created it on pack, they made it much bigger, right? So it sort of like expands over the edge of the can or the bottle. So what I think they did really nicely, again, is that they went back to that sort of like, let's not be ashamed of the sort of timeless spirit of this brand and the nostalgia of this brand. But how do we carefully reinvent that and use that to sort of express the sort of bold spirit of the brand in a way that also feels sort of more contemporary as well? So I think for most big brands, Pepsi, Cadbury, finding that right balance between leveraging nostalgia but not being old-fashioned, that's, and again, between being timeless and timely, to me, that's always that balancing act that they need to manage.
I wanted to move on to sort of more about Cadbury. We've talked about some advertising which felt like bad luck. There was obviously a lot of Cadbury advertising which was very celebrated, won a lot of awards. From an outsider's point of view, was sort of ticking all the boxes. I want to hear a bit more about how that was on the inside.
As we know, there was the famous Gorilla advert that sort of reset expectations forever of all advertising, unfortunately. And I think at the time, it was almost a problem of good luck. Like, it was an incredible piece of advertising, but it almost trapped the team into sort of a formulaic view on how advertising needed to work. And you say it sort of came at that point in time, and I guess it was the late 2000s into the 2010s, right, when the sort of search for breakthrough, for cut through, for how to grab consumers' attention, how to create likes and shares, etc., was really starting to come to the fore. And so in its moment, it wasn't the wrong piece of advertising. It was an incredibly powerful piece. But I know when I joined, one of the things we talked about a lot was The problem it did is it kind of created this. It was almost a victim of its own success because it created this this paradigm that we had to follow, and every piece of advertising we did after that, nothing quite delivered on that same level of surprise. And so it was it's just a pure case of diminishing returns. The team was incredibly brave, but also just very lucky that first ad was so powerful.
It was kind of lightning in a bottle. Yeah.
Exactly. And the challenge was it didn't really have any, going back to that timeless purpose thing, it didn't really have any essence of Cadbury in it. Like the idea of joyfulness, sure, but there was nowhere to expand that and continue that theme over time. So that was by far the biggest problem, I think. And then I think they quickly realized that while the idea of the sort of joyful feeling you get from chocolate wasn't wrong per se, it was lacking something. It felt a bit one-dimensional for the team, and clearly was one-dimensional in terms of how it was being executed, because the team were really struggling, not just through advertising, but also below the line. They were just really struggling to work out, how do I communicate this in a way what's my brief, basically, for what I need to communicate, because it's so wide-ranging. But I think most importantly, the biggest issue that the team faced was that it wasn't really unique to Cadbury. I mean, it was very generic to the category. If you go back to really the heart of it, there was nothing that was particularly unique. And it wasn't really linked into the purpose of the brand at all. So I think 2017, 2018, the team took a really just step back and said, from a marketing communication standpoint, something wasn't really working. And then from a brand and a business standpoint, the business was suffering as well. I mean, it wasn't all connected, but there was a problem from a marketing standpoint and there was a problem from a business standpoint. So again, I think the sort of change context moment was the business was struggling and they were just almost like running out of steam on the advertising side. And so the team took a step back, and I think, again, reminiscent of the Pepsi example, they went back and said, well, what is it that's at the heart of this brand of Cadbury Dairy Milk? You'll know the 1.5 glasses of milk, right? Like a glass and a half of milk is the heart of the Cadbury brand. So the brand, they went back to it and said, well, let's go back to the history of this brand. And fundamentally, this is a brand that's actually about generosity. It's about giving a little extra. And they were like, oh, there's something really powerful in that A, feels true to the category, right? There's obviously links into the idea of the pleasure of the category, but it's also unique or speaks to the product truth of Cadbury Dairy Milk. And it also is something the brand can really stand behind because it's something, there's a legacy within Cadbury itself. This rich theme of generosity that we can actually really get behind and refocus on. And I think a big part of that, again, was a big part of then the way that they found a way to communicate it. Because if you can think about it, I think, well, that sounds really boring. That sounds really dull. Like, how are we going to communicate that in a way that's going to cut through? And then I think when they came back with this idea of generosity, what the team realized is actually the power of understated human storytelling can break through just as well as shouting loud and having a 800-pound gorilla in the room. In fact, there was one I saw a couple of months ago, just before I left, where the team I think it was in Malaysia or Indonesia, were looking at dementia. So they're trying to think, how do we tell a story that will also speak to people lots of people in the world going through this with an older parent. And they just did an incredible piece of communication, which made me cry as well, which is about a mom and her daughter reminiscing about the past, and Cadbury Dairy Milk being sort of part of that trigger that triggers the mom's memories. And just what an incredible way to talk about a very difficult topic, but actually in a very authentic way, through a simple piece of chocolate that can sort of trigger these memories.
The other one that gets me is the Quaker advert. I don't know if you've seen it. I think it might be Quaker Canada. It's basically this child grows up and he always has a bowl of Quaker with his dad, and it shows the two of them getting older and obviously at some point the dad's not there anymore. You're absolutely right. Sometimes you can just find that, that human truth linked to a product, and it can just bring up a lot of memories and kind of nostalgia for that brand in that moment.
Right, and I think, because, you'd gone from this, suddenly, we were putting gorillas on, we had crazy kids, and now we're going to go to this very dramatically different sort of look and feel. And obviously it was a journey. It wasn't just from A to B. But I think that was showing some of that content and seeing the emotional reaction of the internal team to that content. Then they could yes, this goes back to what you said before, Laura, is there is a human piece to this. There's a feeling in the room, people yes, this feels like Cadbury. This feels like Pepsi. This just feels right to me as a brand owner as well as to a consumer as well. And I think it just goes back to that power of very emotional storytelling done in the right way, because every brand is different and every team and communicate and organization is different. And yet, many of us sit through presentations every day, internal, external presentations, and there's not an ounce of storytelling in it. And yet it is the most human thing in the world to persuade and inspire. I mean, we've been doing it for millennia, right? Tens of millennia. We've been telling our stories to tell the next generation what to do, to stay away from the tigers, to eat this thing and not eat this thing. Our entire cultural history, wherever we come from in the world, is made up of stories and parables and tales and poems, and they're all about stories. And I think, it's sad that corporate life sort of forgets that actually that's the way to drive persuasion and communication in many cases.
I couldn't agree more.
Nick, it's been so good to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on. Best of luck with all the changes coming and with your new venture.
Thanks, and good to see you all again. It's been a lot of fun.
A real pleasure to see you, Nick. Thanks. Wow. Well, what I loved about that was Nick's ability to really set out the stall and champion the power of qual, and not only talking about something that's so important, which is what is unsaid in conversations and sort of reading that mood and dynamics, but also lots of inspiration about how to navigate that in a business, how to storytell that in a business, evoking a feeling that gives meaning to data and makes people energized and pulling in the same direction.
Absolutely, yeah. And the fact that became 50% of his role is,
Yes.
is, I mean, I guess that just shows you something, right? And in the case of Cadbury, with the, £800 gorilla, that's a really exciting advert and it won lots of awards, but ultimately they do need to come back to what is the reason that people are going to buy chocolate? Yes, it's great to capture attention, but how are we going to sell more chocolate bars? And something like generosity can provide lots of different layers for a long-standing advertising campaign to come off the back of that.
Yeah, to me, it's about precision of terms because, yes, chocolate absolutely brings joy, and that is very true and very exciting. But if you gave that as a brief to a category manager or someone trying to bring it to life in a retail environment, it can take you in all sorts of places that can be very far from the brand. When you link to generosity, you not only link to very specific occasions and a very specific mood, you link back to the product, you link back to that heart of they've always given a little bit more. And I think that's something that is really interesting from an emotional perspective, but frankly also from a functional perspective. And when you're going up against private label, you need those rational RTBs to give meaning to, the more emotional levers. So, really fascinating example of how precision of terms and really understanding what your drivers are is so effective.
100%. And it was great to hear him talk about how well that translated across the world as well in the different markets they had.
Yes. Yeah. Well, great stuff. See you next week.
See you next week. Thanks for listening. If you'd love to hear more from marketers, entrepreneurs, and business leaders about how to use the art of persuasion to drive your business forward, then make sure you're following the podcast in your favourite podcast app. And just a last ask from us. This is a new podcast, and we'd love it if you could be persuaded to help us spread the word by telling somebody else about it, leaving us a review, or even better, sharing an episode on social media. Search The Forge on LinkedIn.